a lot of things, because I've heard you over here for the last couple of days, and a lot of things that you base yourself up on is moral absolutism. So, in fact, I do consider myself a moral relativist. So, obviously, because I'm a moral relativist, I do not need God in my life. So, so then I just have a couple of questions that I want to direct towards you concerning moral relativism. Okay, you say morality is absolute, but my first question to you is, and one of the favorite examples that you like to use is there a time when the rape of a woman is acceptable? Well, my answer to that would be, well, not more than a couple of centuries ago, raping of a woman was considered to be spoils of war, which meant that until somebody stood up and said, hey, we should not do this anymore, raping of a woman for spoils of war was considered an acceptable practice. So my question to you is if morality is absolute, then why does it change?
Great question. When I say that there are a few moral absolutes, I am not saying that everybody follows those absolutes. Obviously, God has given us a free will, which means that obviously we can rationalize evil, or we can accept our society's definition that rape is okay as a spoil of war, or slavery is okay because it greases the economic wheels of our culture. But that doesn't change the fact that we have consciences that tie us into objective morals. And the only way there can be an objective moral is if there is some mind prior to the human mind that has defined what that moral is. If there's no mind prior to the human mind who defines what objective morality is, then it's obviously people who define morality, which means it's relative depending upon which person you're talking to.
Okay, then, but then you seem to talk from a perspective where you're saying, but I have reached this moral absolute. Or, I mean, my question to you is then, what keeps people, like, decades from now looking back upon this time period and saying, that person was not living out what's morally absolute? What keeps them from doing that? Because at this time period of a couple of centuries ago where that was a accepted practice, people didn't think of it as anything wrong. So obviously you don't think of some of the things that you support as wrong. So what keeps people from saying that in the future?
Okay, I am convinced that just because I don't think something's wrong does not make it wrong. In other words, I'm convinced that I don't create reality. The challenge for me is to get in touch with reality. Let's say that I think that racism is good. That doesn't make racism good, just because I think that. My thoughts can be wrong. I am convinced that all people have equal value, but all ideas do not have equal value. Some ideas are true, other ideas are false. And the idea that racism is good, I am convinced, is a false idea. Wrong idea.
Okay. But then, so then in that context, so let's bring up like a major moral issue, which is abortion, between the choice of a woman and the life of a child. Like, how do you determine which one is right based on moral absolutes?
Okay, great example. Abortion. If abortion is simply removing excess skin, I think it's hard to make a case that abortion is wrong. If abortion is murdering a child, I think the majority of us would agree that murdering children is not good. So the first thing you have to do is you have to answer the question, what is abortion? Is it simply removing excess skin? Nothing wrong with that. I peel my calluses, you cut your fingernails and toenails all the time. Nothing wrong with removing excess skin. Or is abortion terminating a human life motivated by inconvenience? Then, if you conclude that abortion is murdering a child, then you've got to ask yourself, is murder wrong? Now, I am convinced to the root of my being that murder is absolutely evil. And therefore, I don't care how many people want to tell me that murder's right, I'm convinced it's absolutely evil. So that's how I think through that. Does that make any sense?
Okay. Sure, but I'm still kind of not convinced that there are absolute morals. So, because the idea of God fails when there is no absolute morals. So, how can you convince me that there's absolute morals?
All right. The way that I reach the point of being convinced that there are absolute morals is to try and live out moral relativism.
Okay.
If you believe that morality is relative, live it out.
Okay.
Which means, when someone steals your money,
Right.
don't look at them and say, you should not have stolen my money. Instead say to them, from my perspective, it's wrong that you stole my money, but obviously from your perspective, it was just fine for you to steal my money. I'm not absolutely right, you're not absolutely wrong. It's all relative. Get married. And when your wife looks you in the face and says something very cutting, very mean, don't look at her and say, you know, that was really mean. Instead say, well, from my perspective, that was not a very nice thing to say, but I realize that it's all relative, and therefore, what will be will be.
I'm going to disagree with that because I don't think relativism as a laws of moral is a call to action. More or less, I think it's more of like a sense of awareness where you say people have different moral values. However, that does not necessarily mean I have to stand up like that. I have to defend other people's moral views. If my moral views conflict with other people's moral views, I can still very much say I don't agree with you, and I'm going to act in a way that I don't agree with you. That doesn't mean relativism is wrong. It's just saying I disagree with you.
Sure, I agree. I'm right with you. You're right. A moral relativist can look at someone else and say, I don't agree with you. But what a moral relativist cannot say is, what you say is really absolutely wrong.
Right.
Instead, a moral relativist has to acknowledge whatever my position is regarding murder, child molestation, and rape, the opposite position of whatever it is I hold is equally valid. The opposite is equally valid because it's all relative.
Right. But that doesn't mean I have to stand up for it. Like, I could still say it's equally valid, but since it disagrees with my own, I'm going to fight for my own values. And that does not necessarily mean my morals are absolute. I'm just fighting for what I believe in.
Yeah, well, why would you fight for a relative moral?
Well, my own morals. I'm not fighting for relative morals. I'm fighting for my own morals.
Yeah, but if you believe that your own morals are relative, why would you want to fight for them?
Because things that I consider immoral are not beneficial to me. They cause me pain and they cause me suffering, so I'm obviously going to try to defend myself for self-preservation.
Yeah, but obviously morality goes beyond just self-preservation. Obviously, if your wife is mean to you, it's not going to destroy you, okay? You're still going to live. All right, so why on earth would you confront your wife with, that is not a good way to have a relationship. To speak to each other in such a demeaning, degrading way is not very good. So why would you try and push that? Isn't that rather arrogant?
Sure.
So, I mean, if you honestly believe that all morality is relative, then someone might make a mistake in murdering somebody, but it's just a mistake. Now, maybe you want to imprison those people who make mistakes, but it's all relative, so it's not something you should be getting too upset about.
Well, I mean, if I value human life and if that's my own morals, and if somebody murders somebody that I value, that's obviously going to affect me and cause me to act in a way.
Yeah, but why do you value human life? What's the basis of the value of human life?
Because I'm choosing to value them.
Good. So you're choosing to value human life, and I'm choosing to help the communist dream come about, and in order to do that, I've got to slaughter a few million Russians in order to kick out the czars and have the communist dream, which will provide the most amount of good for the most amount of people. So
Right.
that's my trip. I'm not right, you're not right, I'm not wrong, you're not wrong. It's all relative from your worldview.
Right, but I can still fight for what I believe. That doesn't mean I have to stand up for what you're doing just because it's relative.
Well, yeah, you can fight for what you believe, or you can just lie down. It really doesn't matter.
Okay, but I'm still going to choose to fight. So then how, if I still choose to fight for what I believe, and thus I overcome whatever you believe, then does what I believe become morally absolute, or does it
No, it doesn't become morally absolute. That's a great point. So you and I disagree morally, and we go to war.
Okay.
And one of us wins, and the other one dies. So now the question is morality defined by power? You've won, I'm dead. So does that mean that right and justice are defined by who wins the war? If the Nazis would have won World War II, would that make anti-Semitism good and right?
I mean, from their perspective, there was nothing wrong with it. From my perspective, there is something wrong with it. So, I mean, we're still just disagreeing.
Exactly. But the question is it more, is there, when we say that anti-Semitism is wrong, is that just a biased perspective? Or are we tying into reality that anti-Semitism really is absolutely wrong?
I think it's a biased perspective.
Exactly. That's what the position of relativist is. You think it's a biased perspective. I don't think you really can live that out. Let's say you have a little child, and let's say that someone abuses that child. I don't think you're going to be willing to say, well, from my perspective, that's wrong, but I'm only relatively correct, so I understand that it might be right what you did when you abused my child. I think you're going to act as if the abuse of my child was absolutely evil and perverted, and I'm going to go after you with everything I can.
I mean, like, I'm still realizing that that person's moral values said that there's nothing wrong with raping a child, but since it contradicted my own moral views, but yes, thus, and since it was my child, thus I'm going to go with everything I have against it. It's not because I'm saying what I believe is absolute. It's saying what I believe and what you believe conflict with each other, and you cause me an inconvenience. So thus I'm going to go after you.
Right. But I think that the passion with which you go after me for abusing your child contradicts your relativism. I think the passion that you go after me with when I abuse your child communicates that your child really does have worth and value, and when I abused your child, that was absolutely evil. I think if you're going to be a consistent moral relativist, you're going to have to be less committed to your position, because you realize that your position and the position opposite of your position are equally valid.
I mean, but then it would probably be different for me if it was like some random child that I did not know. If I heard a story of a child that was physically abused, and I'd probably be pretty upset about it, but if it was my child, then that changes things.
Right. Which I think is the argument of the Darwinists, right? That the reason you will protect your child is simply because of a biological tie.
Yeah.
And I would insist, baloney, I would insist that although the biological tie is definitely real and definitely there is more to my love for my child than simply a biological drive. There is the ability to love. I think the proof of that is the ability to be a deadbeat dad. I don't have to be a loving dad. I can be a deadbeat dad, and I can be abusive if I want to of my children. Or I can choose to be a loving father. So I don't think I have to love my children. I think all of us are too keenly aware of fathers who do not care for their children. They're deadbeat dads. I think that points to free will, obviously.
Well, to prove your religion correct, in a sense,
yes,
wouldn't you have to prove others wrong?
Okay. You can't prove it. All right?
Well,
you can't prove God exists. I could never prove God exists. The question is not proof. The question is, what's most reasonable to believe in light of the evidence? See, we all have a worldview. And if you ever have a professor who says to you, I base my life on proof, boy, you better go after the dude. And you better go ask him, oh, really? Tell me, professor, what are you living for? And secondly, what's the evidence that what you're living for is true? The proof. And you're going to watch him or her stumble all over her words. Everybody has a worldview. Every atheist, every agnostic, every Hindu, Buddhist, Jew, Muslim, Christian. None of us can prove that our worldview is correct. The materialist says, you want to know what the bottom line principle is? Matter, material. Now, it's very logical if you're a materialist to live for money. You don't have to, but it's very logical, right? Because reality, bottom line principle is matter. So live for money and live for expensive toys and gadgets. What's the pantheist say? The pantheist says, nature is God. You're God. So therefore, meditate and get in touch with the deity that you are and the deity in the tree. That's faith. That's a worldview. What does the empiricist say? The empiricist says, I have faith that the bottom line principle, that ultimate reality is what I can see, smell, taste, hear, and touch. Well, you can't prove that, my empiricist friend. That's your worldview. That's your faith. And obviously, the biological Darwinist has profound faith that biology is the bottom line. And that be it your religion, be it your ethics, be it your love or whatever, it all has a biological root. Okay, I'm a follower of Christ. I believe there's a God who created all of this. That is my worldview. And it informs me why I have my rational mind, because it's a gift from a rational creator. It informs me why life exists, because life comes from life, not from non-life. It informs me that the moral absolutes that I am convinced are real, like if someone picks up a gun and shoots you because you're of a different race, that's absolutely evil, because it's a violation of your worth as a person. It's a violation of the value of justice. I am convinced that faith in Christ makes the most sense of life as we experience it. But everybody has faith, and so the question is, what's the evidence that your faith is right, is true? But I'm really obviously frustrated with people who say, oh, you religious people, you have faith. The rest of us, we really use logic, and we really think. Excuse me, you pompous rascal. I can promise you, there are many devout Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, Christians who really think. The question is, why do you embrace the worldview you do? Because none of us can prove that our worldview is true. You can't prove it. The question is, does the evidence point to your worldview being true? And obviously, the woman who was speaking before you, did you see how I was trying to push her and ask her, can you really live out your atheism? And I think I almost had her to the point of realizing I can't live it out. Because when I was really hurt by that person, I obviously don't know how she was hurt, but when she was being hurt by that warped person, she wasn't lapsing back into her relativism saying, you know, maybe this is okay. From my perspective, it's wrong, but from his perspective, it's all right. So, you know, it's maybe okay. No. She was holding to, this is really, really wrong. Well, that's not the position of a relativist. The position of a relativist is, nothing's really wrong. It's subjectively wrong, and my opinion is it's wrong, but your opinion is right, and I'm not right and you're not wrong. It's all relative. So you can't live that out. So if you can't live out your worldview, you better go back and be really skeptical about whether your worldview is correct.
Well, what about the evidence that at any given moment a hurtling asteroid could come and blow us out of the universe, or the evidence that there's cancer and that people die on a regular basis from horrible causes? So not at all that this is a fly in the face to theism proper, but if God is both omnibenevolent and omniscient and omnipotent, why wouldn't he then design the universe purportedly so asteroids wouldn't kill us, or so that we wouldn't get cancer and die?
Great question. That's one of the hardest questions for me, to tell you the truth. And thank you for raising it. When you read the Bible, you will bump into Genesis chapter 3, which records how created beings, human beings, chose to flip God off, chose to tell God, get out of here, get lost. And because God gave us the gift of being a person, not a machine, because God is a heavenly Father, not a heavenly engineer, because he chose to create us as persons with free will, he respects our free will. We tell him to get lost, he takes a step back, and chaos erupts, and cancer, and heart failure, and death come into the picture. That is not God's design. That is not God's intent, that we die. But the wages of sin, the result of me flipping God off, is death. Christ comes to bleed and die on a cross to give us the ultimate solution: forgiveness and eternal life. In a heaven where there will be no more cancer, no more heart failure, but eternal life in the presence of God. But you and I are born into an unjust, unfair world, not because God created it that way, but because when we human beings told him to get lost, he respects our request, takes a step back, and chaos erupts.
So it kind of sounds like then that God, this might be too strong a word, but punished us by asteroids, cancer, and tsunamis and earthquakes?
Yes, God does judge at times, but no, the vast majority of chaos in nature is a direct result of God stepping back, and chaos erupts.
So then you wouldn't attribute things like earthquakes to like geological laws or the way physics works and the reasons why these physical occurrences like tsunamis, earthquakes, asteroids happen isn't because of the underlying physical laws of the universe, but because God just decided to kind of flip a coin and let whatever happens happen?
No, I would say there are physical laws, and we better study those physical laws and learn those physical laws. But the whole idea of tsunamis, earthquakes destroying human life is not the way God created this world to be experienced. It's a result of the earth being cursed and chaos erupting. Although there is order in this universe, there's a tremendous amount of chaos. And I would argue that God did not create that chaos. God created order, but as a result of us human beings rebelling against him and him stepping back and beginning to vacate the premises a bit, chaos erupts.
I guess I'm just a little confused as to how, I mean, given, granted, like, that biblical, historical analysis aside, I'll just leave that aside, but it really does seem like, I mean, it's hard to blame us ignorant, lowly humans, because really, I'm willing to admit that I'm ignorant, and I'm assuming that every human doesn't have perfect knowledge and doesn't make the best decisions all the time. It's hard to blame us ignorant, lowly humans for God, the omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient being, taking a step back. It seems like if he were omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, he would kind of take our ignorance into consideration and then keep the world design, saying like, sorry guys, but it seems like there's a disjunct.
Absolutely correct. If it's just an issue of ignorance, I would have a problem. But evil, sir, is not just an issue of ignorance. Racism is not just an issue of ignorance. Rape is not just an issue of ignorance. Murder is not just an issue of ignorance. It's a very deliberate decision to do that which is wrong. And God holds us responsible for our decisions to do wrong. Not only that, I agree with you. There's no way that I can know everything. We are both ignorant. I am ignorant with you in many, many ways, in the majority of ways. Here's what's really absurd. If you think about it, what's really absurd is that the God who's omnipotent and created everything loves you, loves me. You want to talk about absurd? That's the height of absurdity. That's either the height of human arrogance, that the God who created the cosmos would give a rip about this little insignificant speck of dust, or it's the most phenomenal news in the world possible. So that's what we got to figure out. Is it the most ridiculous, absurd piece of information, or is it the most exciting news possible?
I don't want to ruffle feathers, but it seems like your argument just kind of got a little circular. I asked about, essentially the underpinnings of believing in God, and said, and it came kind of full circle because, well, I asked, isn't it a little odd that a God would act this way? And then you said, well, isn't it a little odd that God loves you? And that assumes the premise that there is a God to kind of...
Oh, well, then let me straighten out the circle for you.
Okay.
What I thought you were implying is, Cliff, isn't it absurd that God takes me so seriously that if I tell him, bug off, get lost, that he would actually do that?
Sure.
And see, my point is, yes, God does take you so seriously that if you tell him to bug off, he will get lost. Guess what? He takes you so seriously that he loves you. He takes you so seriously that he wants you to spend eternity with him in heaven. So I think you've put your hand on a very good point, which is God takes you seriously. You matter to him. And if you want to go out and destroy human life, he takes that very seriously. He's not going to intervene necessarily, but there will be a day of judgment when he judges you for that and holds you responsible. And if you say to him, oh, that was just a mistake I made when I went out and raped the woman and murdered the guy and stole the guy's money, that was just a mistake, he's going to say, guess what, buddy, I don't accept that. I gave you a free will, I gave you a rational mind, and you chose to do that, and I'm going to judge you for it. And also, he takes you so seriously that he wants to forgive you for the wrong that you've done. He actually loves you and wants you to spend eternity with him in heaven. He values you. He takes you seriously. And in one sense, I think that's absurd that the creator of the cosmos would take me, a little speck of dust, seriously.
So That's a really good point. Like, we are little specks in the cosmos, and I mean, we've already established that we're really ignorant of a lot of things. I guess jumping back into a more philosophical level, so how are we, as ignorant, very limited, very finite things, ever supposed to comprehend or even comprehend that there exists a very infinite, very unlimited thing? And even if we're able to know that there is such a thing, how are we to know that he has the attributes you just named, that he forgives us, he loves us, and he has this relationship with us?
Great question. The reason that I am not an epistemological nihilist, thinking that the human brain is stupid and out of touch with reality, is because I'm convinced that behind your rational mind is not the irrational. See, that's one of the reasons I'm a theist. I look at your mind, listen to the way you can think and articulate, and I'm impressed. All right? And so now I've got a decision to make. The rational mind that you have, it comes from the irrational. That's atheism. The rational comes from the irrational. That, for me, is really stupid. It is far more reasonable for me to believe the rational mind that I have the honor of talking with is the gift of an incredibly rational being. The rational comes from the rational. The rational does not come from the irrational. Okay, so that's the first point. Now the second point is, you're absolutely right. There ain't no way I'm smart enough to figure out God. And it just might be that this idea that God loves me is just simply human arrogance. God knows a good thing when he sees it, so that's why he loves me. You know, raw arrogance. But that's where Jesus Christ steps into the picture. Jesus Christ claimed to be revealing God. Now, the only reason I've had the privilege of having this discussion with you, and I have enjoyed it immensely, is because you have chosen to be very vulnerable. And you've opened up and you've told me your honest thinking. And I interpret you as being very genuine. I could be wrong, obviously. I'm not all-knowing, but the way you've talked with me, I think, has been very genuine. But the only reason I've had the privilege of talking with you, sir, is because you have initiated, you have opened up, and you have spoken very thoughtfully, very respectfully, very articulately, and that's an honor for me to talk with a person like you. But if you lied to me, if you played head games with me, or if you were totally silent, I would never have the privilege of getting to know you. Well, not only is that true between you and me, it's also true between God and me. If God is silent, or if God lies, or if God plays head games with me, I'm never going to know God. But if God chose to open up and reveal himself in Jesus Christ, that he really does love me, that he really does take me seriously, then it's possible that I can know this God.
How are we to, I guess, what's your proof for Jesus' resurrection would be a more important and pressing question.
You bet. Once again, I really intentionally steer away from the word proof, because I really don't think I can prove that Jesus rose from the dead, the same way I can't prove that God exists. I can't prove anything in life, really. I follow evidence, and then I ask myself, what's most reasonable to believe in light of the evidence? All right. Obviously, when it comes to the resurrection, the evidence is historical in nature. It's based on the trustworthiness of eyewitness testimony. So we've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, James. We have Paul writing in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that over 500 people saw Jesus risen from the dead. The historical record is he was arrested, put through a mockery of a trial, nailed to a wooden crossbeam. A Roman soldier jams a spear into the side of Christ. Watery serum separate from clotted blood flows from the side. Medical sign of death. Separation of the watery serum from the clotted blood. They take his body off the cross, they put it in a tomb, they roll a stone in front of the tomb to make sure there's no hanky-panky, no Passover plot, no stealing of the dead body. His disciples are not a bunch of glassy-eyed, mesmerized believers. I love the way the Gospels describe the apostles as Christ deniers, Christ betrayers, Christ deserters. They were not true believers. They doubted, all of them, and they ditched Christ in his moment of need. 3 days after he dies, the Gospels record that he first appears to some women. The reason I find that interesting is because of the grotesque sexism of the first century. If I was trying to foist a fail as a male author on society that the dead Christ had risen from the dead, I never would have had my first eyewitness be women. A woman's testimony was not even allowed in court. It was sick. Incredibly grotesque sexism. But the Gospels have the ring of authenticity as Christ first appears, risen from the dead, to a grief-torn woman named Mary Magdalene. Then, over a period of 40 days, he appears to over 500 people who see him at different times in different places, risen from the dead. Now, what really kicks it home for me is those folks, the majority of them, who saw Christ risen from the dead, stood before Roman soldiers, and the Roman soldiers said, "See, Caesar is Lord and live," and emperor worship is the way we're unifying the Roman Empire right now, or else maintain that your Jesus is risen from the dead, that he is Lord, and we will kill you for it. And these eyewitnesses who saw Christ risen from the dead said, "We have seen Jesus risen from the dead, he is Lord," and they died, not for a belief. They died not for a passion. They died for what they claimed to have seen, the dead Christ risen from the dead. Which means, if they hadn't seen him risen from the dead, they died for what they knew to be a lie. I think if you study psychology, you will find out that people will not die to cover up what they know to be a lie.
I really don't want to sound inflammatory, but...
You're not, don't worry.
Okay, thanks.
I like you a lot.
Thanks, appreciate it. That really...
Thank you.
Makes me feel good. So it seems intellectually prudent to ask the question. I mean, it's essentially historical and testimonial evidence for the resurrection of Christ. So, I mean, I don't want to ruffle feathers. I really don't. But what is the evidence that the first century Christians weren't simply a cult? And we've seen in our own century, cults do horrendous things on false beliefs.
Great point. And I think you've got to ask that question, because I think if you don't ask that question, you're setting yourself up to get ripped off in life. Now, when you read the Gospels, what you'll notice is Jesus bends over backwards to teach his followers to ask those questions. For instance, in Matthew chapter 7, verse 15, Jesus says, "Beware of false prophets," the cult leaders. "Beware of false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. A good tree bears good fruit. A bad tree bears bad fruit. Good trees don't bear bad fruit, and bad trees don't bear good fruit. So check them out and never blindly believe, because you will be ripped off." Then in John chapter 7, verse 24, Jesus says, "Stop judging by mere appearances, make a right judgment." I like that. Don't just judge according to appearances, get into it. Check out the evidence, make a right judgment. Secondly, when you read the Gospels, you'll notice there's a brutal honesty about the sins of the guys who wrote those documents, about the sins of the leaders of the first century church, like Peter, who's pictured in the Gospels. He's leading the church, right? And he's pictured in the Gospels as he denied knowing Christ. I am so glad that that kind of honesty and vulnerability is in the Gospels, because it clearly shows me that these are not written by people who say, "Oh, you know me, I got it all together, you know, and maybe you'll be fortunate one day to get it together the way I did." No, these guys are brutally honest about recording the sins, the failures of these eyewitnesses of Christ. That lends tremendous credibility for me in their writings. The same way you've stood up here and said, "Man, I don't claim to know everything." Well, guess what? If you stood here and said, "I know everything," I'd be going, "Hey, you are really out of touch with reality." But no, you gain credibility when you say, "You know, I don't know everything, and I'm searching for truth," and that means you're in touch with reality. You tell me you know everything in biology, or you know everything about, I mean, that's ridiculous. So that credibility is built, that respect is built with that kind of honesty and humility. And that's what you see when you read those Gospels.